Greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well today. Today I have some terrifying encounters to share with you. Before we jump into those encounters, though, a couple links. As you know, I rely on my Patreon, my PayPal, and my merch store to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Those links are in the description below. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters Volume 1, 2, and 3. The audiobook version, written by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeffrey Nadolny, is available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes. The links to those are in the description. Now I've taken enough of your time. Let's get on with today's upload. Shall we? Today's first encounter. I was camping in Little Cottonwood Canyon on October 11th of last year with 5 of my buddies. We had a canyon party and it was super fun. The wind started to pick up right after the party as we were getting ready for bed. We were all sharing a tent. We were about 1.5 miles off the road heading up the canyon in a very secluded area. When around 2 or 3 in the morning, we started to hear this mechanical-like THX movie intro slowed down, growing faster and faster. The bass got insane and it felt like something was coming. All of my friends heard the same thing and it scared the shit out of us. Then, as the sound was reaching its peak, it went dead silent, and this huge rush of wind hit the tent. The next morning, we all awoke to this huge stone underneath the tarp of our tent, right where we had been sleeping. We got out of the tent. Our entire tent had been moved 5 feet, which scared the shit out of us again. I'm not a big believer in the paranormal or aliens, for that matter, but this occurrence was the first time I had no real explanation. There was 5 adults sleeping in a tent. There's no way it could have moved that far on flat land without us noticing. Until this day, I get goosebumps about that noise. I thought I was dying. The noise lasted about what felt like 2 minutes. I was dead sober while my other friends were a bit tipsy. Does anyone have an explanation for this? Today's second encounter. This event took place in 1992. I was just a young man and in the military. I was stationed at Fort Hood, Texas at the time. Those of you that are familiar with Fort Hood will know what I am talking about when I say North Fort Hood. For those of you that are not, let me try to explain, so you'll better understand why we were where we were when this happened. Fort Hood is a very large military base. It's probably one of the largest military bases by land in the United States. The main base, where you would find all of the buildings and motor pools full of vehicles and so forth, is just called Fort Hood. It's on the south end of the overall land that comprises Fort Hood, and just outside of its gates is the town of Killeen. Most of Fort Hood is wilderness. The wilderness is a training area for soldiers to go and train in. And there's also a large impact area for the artillery units that have to train with their cannons. At the far northern end of the base, there is a small complex called North Fort Hood. It takes about 30 to 40 minutes to drive from the main base up to Fort North Hood. In the early 90s, there was not much in a way of buildings or infrastructure at North Fort Hood. The unit I was assigned to had to calibrate a piece of equipment, and that meant that it had to be set up and left in place for about a week while calibration took place. I'm not going to get into the details about this equipment, and it's not vital to the story. What is important to note is that we had to set up this equipment on North Fort Hood during the process. During the day, we had some soldiers who were there working on the calibrations, but at night, we obviously were not going to leave this expensive equipment unguarded. So every night, we would leave 2 soldiers with the equipment to keep an eye on things and make sure nothing happened to it. It was very easy duty by every measure. There was a tent to stay in and plenty of food. Soldiers who stayed the night to guard the equipment got the next day off. Basically, we would just sit in the tent, play cards or some other game, and just keep an eye on things. It was basically camping. I volunteered to take Thursday night as my turn at guard duty. This was because I had vacation leave time starting the following Monday. My rationale was simple. Take guard duty on Thursday night, get Friday off, and start my leave time early. It was myself and another young soldier who was a friend of mine. Both of us were just kids. I had just turned 21, and I believe he was just 19 or so. Keep in mind that it's 1992, so cell phones did exist, but were by no means as prolific as they are now. It was actually pretty rare to see a person with a cell phone, and when you did, they were in these big leather carrying bags. They were huge, and we called them bag phones, and they were very expensive, needless to say. Neither of us had a cell phone. Why is this important? Because we were dropped off for guard duty around 5 p.m., and everyone else left. We had no vehicle and no way to communicate with anyone. We were entirely alone if anything happened, and of course, we weren't expecting anything to happen. It was, after all, very easy duty. Watch the equipment, play some cards, eat some chow, no problem. We were sitting in the tent when the first wind started to pick up, and I noticed some storm clouds moving in from the west. Now, whoever had set up the hex tent apparently had no interest in doing it properly, because as the winds got worse, the tent was really leaning as though it might fold at any time. Clearly, we were about to get hit with a pretty severe thunderstorm, and anyone who has ever lived in central Texas can tell you that the storms there can blow up quick and pretty violent. Fortunately for us, there was a 2.5 truck there with a shelter on the back. For those of you that don't know what a 2.5 is, it's a large 6-wheel drive truck. And if you want to get an idea of what it looks like, Google M35A2 truck. This particular truck had a shelter on the back, and that's where we retreated to in order to get out of the path of the approaching storm. Before anyone asks, I should note that we could not drive the truck away from the campsite because it was needed for the calibration, and we would not abandon our post anyway. This falls under the first general order, and anyone who has ever been in the Army knows what that means. So we secured ourselves in the shelter while the storm passed, and it was a typical Texas frog strangler for sure. Miraculously, the tent did not blow over, and I was surprised by that. Still, we decided to stay in the back of the truck until dawn, as we had already moved one of our cots inside. We finally laid down about 10 p.m., and it was pretty quiet. This is a very remote area, and while we were in the clearing next to the runway, there were no buildings present, and all around this airstrip is just woods. Today there are buildings there, as I've recently looked at the location on Google Maps. At any rate, we had left the door on the shelter just slightly open for 2 reasons. Because the shelter had no power running to it, so there was no airflow going through it. Shutting the door would have left us susceptible to the effects of carbon monoxide. We needed fresh air. We also needed to be able to hear what was going on outside. We decided to take turns getting some rest, although we had been told we were allowed to sleep if we wanted to. We were still on base, and there was absolutely no reason to expect that anything was going to happen. My friend was on the cot by the door of the shelter, and I was on the floor at the other end. I felt like I had dozed off when I was shaken violently awake. It was my friend, and as I sat up, he was pulling the door to the shelter closed and trying to put a lock on it by using the light from his wristwatch. He was obviously very upset and scared. It was the kind of fear that cannot be faked, as if he was trying to prank me. This was primal fear. I kept asking him what was wrong, and he finally managed to tell me that something had grabbed him by the foot and tried to pull him from the shelter. My first thought that he had dozed off and had a nightmare. But he insisted that he had not even fell asleep and stated whatever grabbed him had said, "We'll be right back for you," and let him go as he was shaking me awake. I wasn't sure if it was a prank or not, but my gut instinct was that he was petrified and his hands were shaking as he tried to lock the shelter door. So there must have been some truth to it. I told him that we couldn't leave the door closed because of the carbon monoxide. I was the higher rank, so technically I was in charge. He refused to stay by the door if it was going to be open even a little bit, so I agreed to switch places with him. I opened the door just a couple of inches and laid down on the cot, still believing he had just had a really bad nightmare. He was on the floor at the other end of the shelter. Within a few minutes, some pretty strange things began to happen. There were scratching sounds on the shelter, scratching on the sides, on the top, and on the front from where the cab of the truck was. A few times the door moved ever so slightly, but never opened. Needless to say that by this time I was convinced that something or someone was definitely outside, and both of us were pretty scared. I reached to the end of the cot as I was on and pulled out a metal cross member that was used to give it tension. After that, I felt under the cot and found a wooden handle to a pickaxe. In the Army, we called this pioneering tools, but most of you will know it's a pickaxe handle without a pickaxe part at the end. This I handed to my friend and instructed him if anyone was to open the door to the shelter, we were going to start beating them with our makeshift weapons. And don't stop beating until whoever it is down on the ground and not moving. The scratching on the exterior of the shelter continued intermittently throughout the night. We made no effort to call out to whomever or whatever it was. I think we were both just in fight mode. If anyone had pulled that door to the shelter fully open, I had full intentions of fighting for all I was worth. I'm certain my friend felt the same way. Eventually it began to get light outside, and as the sky began to get lighter, the scratching stopped. We stayed in the shelter for another 40 or 50 minutes until the sun was fully up. At that point, I said that I was going to push the door all the way open, jump off the back of the truck, and if he saw anyone, just start swinging. So I counted 3, flung the door open, and jumped off the truck. When you're 21, you can jump off a deuce and a half and it doesn't hurt. Now I would be far more cautious. At any rate, there was nothing, not a soul. We looked all around the truck, in the camp, nothing. What I noticed immediately was that while we were leaving boot tracks in the still wet ground, there were no other tracks around the truck at all. I began to look for loose items on the shelter that might account for the scratching sound. Nothing. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or still be on the edge. We packed our gear, and about 30 minutes later, the relief NCO arrived in an HMMWV, the Humvee. He wasn't even fully out of the truck, and we were putting our stuff in it to leave. He laughingly remarked that we seemed ready to go. We never told him a thing. In fact, we never said anything to anyone in our unit about what happened. We probably should have, but I think we were afraid that we maybe have laughed at. At any rate, I got behind the wheel of the Humvee and my friend got in the back on the passenger side. I drove down the road a ways and came to a stop at the main highway that we would take to go back to Fort Hood. At that moment, there came a clear, loud, and distinct clap of thunder. I leaned out the window and looked up, and then I looked back at my friend who was in the back of the truck, and he said something I'll never forget. "There ain't a fucking cloud in the sky, man." I believe I probably set the record for the fastest drive back to Fort Hood in a Humvee that morning. I'm not one to believe in this kind of stuff. I think a lot of this paranormal stuff is just active imaginations, or people making it up. But something happened to us that night, and I will never forget it. It scared the hell out of me, and I don't want to experience anything like that again. Well, that's my story, and it's 100% true. Today's third encounter. Several years ago, my brother was a pastor at a Baptist church on Highway 90 in Dawson, Louisiana. He and his wife lived in a trailer house on the church property. They got home one evening after dark and saw a possum that had been eating their cat food. The possum ran out across the back of the church parking lot, which was lit by security lights, and stopped by the base of a tree about 50 yards from their back door. My brother decided he was tired of this animal eating the cat food. He opened the back door and grabbed his scoped .22, turned off all the lights in the house, and got in a prone shooting position on the floor. He could see the possum at the base of the tree. Its eyes were shining in the light of the security lamps. He decided he would wait until the possum came closer for a clean kill shot. The possum did proceed back towards his house, but stopped under the lights in the middle of the parking lot. That's when he was shocked by the next series of events. The possum morphed into a humanoid figure about 6 feet tall with a very small head. It was very thin and had arms and legs like a human, but also very thin. It began to pace back and forth across the parking lot, but always looking in his direction. He said he could see its eyes shining, and he knew that it knew it was there, even though he was in the dark. He said he was totally creeped out, but decided to wait and see what would happen next. It morphed back into the possum and ran back to its original position at the base of the tree. A few minutes later, his wife came out of the shower wrapped in a towel, and he told her she needed to see something. She got into a prone position next to him, and he directed her to take a look out at the base of the tree, where the possum's eyes were shining. He told her to be very still and watch it with him. He said he wanted her to witness something, but he didn't tell her what he had seen. Shortly, the possum again came out into the middle of the parking lot and morphed into the humanoid shape again. His wife freaked and asked him what it could be. She thought she was looking at a demon. A few seconds later, they heard a loud rustling sound coming from it, and then 2 feathered wings spread out from its back. He said the wingspan had to be at least 12 feet. It then started flapping its wings and rose off the ground and hovered about 15 feet, all the while still looking at them. It then gained altitude and flew toward his house and over his roof. He said they could hear the wings flapping. He said he ran outside and looked back over the top of his house and could see it heading away from them in the moonlight. It then turned and flew back over the top of his house and kept flying until he could no longer see it. Just an FYI, my brother is an avid outdoorsman and hunter, and is very familiar with Louisiana wildlife. He has captured poisonous snakes and alligators by hand, and is not afraid of nothing in the natural world. He told me that he was having a difficult time trying to rationalize what they had seen. He asked me not to tell anyone because he didn't want folks at his church to think he was nuts. Today's final encounter. The person I was dating at the time, Native, invited me to go with them to their grandmother's house for Christmas. This being the first time I had ever been to a Native American reservation, I wasn't sure what to expect. I had lots of ideas regarding what might be, as well as what-ifs. nevertheless excited to go somewhere I had never been before. Most of my excitement was reserved towards learning more about the culture and unique opportunity of visiting a reservation as an outsider. Because of this, I was also a bit nervous. What if I wasn't accepted? Would the people be welcoming, or would they be hostile towards my presence? Although these questions were lingering, most of my fears were quelled by the wonderful hospitality I had been shown by both the grandma and the people I had privilege to interact with while I was visiting. We left our house on Christmas Eve with our dog and started to make the 4-hour journey to his grandma's house. On the way, we saw a beautiful sunset scattered across the mountains. After traveling about 3 hours, we found ourselves at the turnoff that leads to the hour-long drive on a desolate road that would eventually take us to our destination. While on this road, my significant other shared stories of dances and some other practices of his tribe. All of it fascinated me and left me asking more questions than I had imagined asking. By the time we arrived at Grandma's house, it was dark and cold. As I began to unpack the car, my significant other takes our dog a bit away from the house to go to the bathroom. By the time they get back, I've taken our bags inside and locked the car up for the night. As we sit around the kitchen table eating food lovingly cooked by his grandma, we shared stories and played card games. After about an hour, we all said goodnight to one another and got ready to turn in, maybe 12 in the morning. My significant other and I lie down and I call our dog to the bed. A short time thereafter, we fell asleep, although I forgot to turn off the light next to the bed on the nightstand. Maybe around 2 or 3, I awoke to having to use the restroom and noticed that our dog was sitting, just looking at the door that led out into the small hallway. On the other side was a main door to the house. I called to her to come back to bed, and she just put her nose at the base of the bedroom door, sniffing and scratching. Thinking that she had to use the bathroom as well, I walked up to the main house door and opened it and ushered her to go to the bathroom. She ended up just sitting there and staring. After trying to coax her to go outside a few times and failing at my attempts, I closed the door and made my way to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. In the kitchen, there's a big window, and to the right of the sink that overlooks the driveway to the house, with a bit of a light that makes the driveway barely visible. As I reach to turn on the faucet, my head turns to the right to look outside, and I see a dog sitting outside staring into the house. Something was off about this dog, though. It was much larger than a typical large breed dog, by 2 times. I began to get the chills, and internally said, "Fuck this." Grabbing my water and about to head back to bed, the dog gets up and begins to walk away. One thing that I feel I might not convey well is the way the dog walked. It seemed to walk very awkward and almost stiff-like after making my way back to bed and falling asleep, and waking up the next morning while eating breakfast Grandma had made. I nonchalantly asked anyone listening at the kitchen table if the neighbors had an extra large dog. That's when Grandma began to ask questions, and my significant other started to look concerned. Grandma's immediately made a few phone calls, and after a bit of time passed, a native priest and healer arrived at the house, and they began to converse silently with Grandma. Thinking I must have done something wrong, my significant other joins my grandmother in conversation. They all began to look at me and talk more, and then the priest goes around the house with sage and cedar. The healer comes to talk with me and Grandma about my experience, and my significant other disappears outside the house to gather some raw meat. From what I can gather, I encountered something that I should not have the previous night, and by my arrival an outsider, they had to make certain preparations to ensure our safety for the duration of my stay. After this visit, we visited many times after, and I had no other weird experiences, but this experience left me chilled to the bone and will live with me forever for the rest of my life. I can't get over how this dog behaved and how completely large it really was. Okay guys, the first two I wanted to share because they were similar and not really. I'm going to leave it up to you to you guys to figure out what possibly happened in these. I'll let you know what I think. The first one, no idea. And I'm not even going to speculate. Because I don't know. And I don't even want to try to guess. Because it could have been a glitch. It could have been extraterrestrial. It could have been just something even more terrifying. The second one, was, I'm leaning towards a werewolf. Now, the reason why is because they were scratching on the sides of the vehicles. They heard something come up the front of the vehicle. Something obviously could open the door or, place great fear. So I think what would have happened was this werewolf would have came up the front of the truck into the back, and as it went, scraped the sides. The Louisiana encounter, I am saying Rougarou. Now, a lot of people may not realize this, but the Rougarou is, yes, people have claimed it to be a Dogman. Also, people have claimed it to be, these people who live there and have studied these things and practiced the magic around these things or whatever have you. People have claimed that to be a mist, a black mist, an alligator man. But needless to say, they're almost like a shapeshifter, and that's what that possum did. And that's what I feel like this was. I don't feel like it was a demon. I feel honestly like it was a Rougarou. And if you do some research, for those of you that are not and have not been with the channel, because those of you who have been, we've discussed this. But if you do your research and you look, the Rougarou is supposed many different things. So, it's supposed to be able to change form to Wolfman, Alligator Man, a mist, whatever. So check it out. The last one, I'm not going to say Skinwalker because they didn't mention the Navajo land. But what I will say is I believe it was a smaller Dogman or a shapeshifter, just because of how it was sitting. It was two sizes bigger than the largest dog. So, I really think it was a Dogman on that one. Anyway, leave your answers at the bottom in the comments for me. By the way, I am feeling better a little bit. As you can hear, my throat's still a little raspy. Pretty pounding headache today, though. My smell is back somewhat, but everything smells like real bad for some reason, and I'm not sure why that is. But yeah, so thank you everybody who knew I was sick and sent your prayers my way. It really means a lot, and you guys rock. And with that, I want to bid you all farewell. Have a great day, and I may or may not do the historic Dogman Sasquatch encounters in the news tonight. I'm just completely exhausted. This sickness, whatever it is, I really don't want to say, has really kicked my ass and my daughter's. So, needless to say, have a great night, guys. I'm just rambling. I'm going to get this video uploaded and get a little rest and maybe do a historic account later. See ya!